News of the world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Herbert W. Armstrong.
Does God exist? Is the Bible the authentic Word of God? Does it carry authority? Is it actually the Creator God, the supreme mind and purpose, who created everything? Is it that God speaking to mankind? Unless there is some such authority, no one can determine the difference between right and wrong. And legislators could tell you that. Members of Congress can tell you that. Lawyers ought to tell you that. They've been struggling for a long time to know the difference between right and wrong, and they don't know it yet. Well, those questions troubled me very greatly back in 1926, in the spring of 1927. At that time, I discovered in the Bible not only the origin and the purpose of all mankind, and why mankind came to be upon the earth, where we're going, what is the real purpose, why are things like they are, why are we living in a time of awesome progress and at the same time of appalling evils, and the evils are multiplying even faster than the progress. And all of that was explained at that time. Also, I found the roots of the American and the British people. You know, our American and British people don't know who we are. Now, the Jewish people know who they are. They trace their roots, and they trace it through the Bible all the way back to the first created man, Adam. The Arab people of the Arab nations, they trace their roots. They know that they are descended from Ishmael, and Ishmael is mentioned in the historic pages of the Bible, and they trace their origin all the way back to the first created man. Other nations know who they are, and yet our people don't know who we are. We don't know where we came from. What are our roots? Well, it was the most astounding truth I had ever found in my life, and I found it absolutely proved. And I found that it was an absolute proof of the existence of God and an absolute proof of the authenticity of the Bible, because unless there is a God speaking in those pages written up to 3,500 years ago and has brought all these events to pass, no man could have done it. There is no way. It is absolute proof. It's the most astounding thing that I had ever gotten into. And proof of the very existence of God and of the authority of the Bible. Now, go back to the time prior to World War II. Between World War I and World War II, the American and the British people had come to a place of world dominance in which we possessed between us between 2/3 and 3/4 of all the cultivated wealth of this entire earth. Of all the nations on the earth, now we had been small by comparison to such nations as China and Russia. And yet by that time, we did possess more than 2/3 and almost 3/4. And all the other nations combined possessed just a little over 1/4 of all of the wealth. Now, prior to the year of 1800, we were comparatively small. We were not then the greatest economical countries in the world and the greatest financial powers. Where did we come by all of that wealth? How? How did it all happen? Now, let me tell you something I've discovered about the Bible. The Bible is a book of a certain nation. It is the book of Israel, and it's concerned about Israel and only concerned about other nations when they come into contact with Israel. Now, a lot of people didn't realize that, but if you study the Bible, you'll find that's absolutely true. It's concerned about that nation and other nations only as they come into contact with Israel. Now, I found in the Bible some astonishing promises made to Abraham. I think it's well known among so-called biblical scholars that God had promised to Abraham one seed, Jesus Christ, who was to come as the Messiah. Now, the promise of the Messiah was merely a promise of grace. But I discovered that Abraham had received promises from God, according to the Bible, if the Bible is true, promises entirely of race. In the 12th chapter of Genesis and verse 1, we read, "Now the Eternal had said, Get thee out of thy country unto a land that I will show thee, and if you do that, and I will make of thee a great nation." Now that was conditional. They were to become a great nation. Now the Jewish people have not become a great nation. They never were. They are not now. They're one of the small nations of the world, the Jewish people. Now in Genesis 15 and verse 18, Abraham's descendants were to possess the land from the Nile River in Africa all the way over to the Euphrates. And the Jewish people never did. And yet the descendants of Abraham were to inherit all of that land. Now in Genesis 17, when Abraham was 90 years old, God said if he would obey God, that God would make a covenant with him and would multiply his children exceedingly and would become many nations. Now that is rather startling because the Jewish people never became many nations. And yet there was an absolute promise, and later on it was confirmed as a covenant, that they should become many nations. The Jews never did. Now in Genesis 28 and verse 14, Abraham's descendants were to become as the dust of the earth. They'd be so numerous. The Jews never became quite that numerous. And they were to spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south until they encompassed the whole world. Now they were to spread abroad, expand. The Jewish people were scattered abroad, but they never enlarged and they never expanded to a worldwide. And yet the descendants of Abraham were to do just that. And that promise was never fulfilled in the Jews. Now, coming on a little further in Genesis 22, verses 16 and 17, God said, finally, to Abraham, because he had obeyed God, God now made these promises absolutely unconditional, and God was bound. He said that his descendants would be expanded to worldwide proportions, that they would possess the gates of enemy nations. Now, just look back until the most recent times of, say, air travel. All commerce between nations was carried on by the sea lanes and by shipping. And to possess the gate of enemy nations meant to possess certain sea gates, such as Singapore, such as the Cape of Good Hope, the Suez Canal, such as Gibraltar, where they could stop any enemy nation from going through if they possessed it, Cape Horn, the Panama Canal, gates of enemy nations. The Jews never possessed anything like that. And yet, if God is true, if the Bible is true, Abraham's descendants were to do just that. And Abraham's descendants were called the Israelites. You know, this became sort of a mystery as I went along and studied these things. Genesis 26 and verse 4. The descendants of Abraham were to be multiplied